Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Bert Harrell, and I'm Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of History here at Ohio State. I am absolutely delighted to host our graduate student workshop this morning entitled From Ph.D. to Professor. Recent grad alumni share their tips to get on the tenure track. So let me introduce our workshop speakers. First, we have Dr. Aisha Baltaji Ulu Brammer, got her PhD in 2016. She's Assistant Professor of Early Modern Ottoman and Middle Eastern History in the Departments of History and of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. A specialist in Middle Eastern history, Aisha focuses on early modern Ottoman and Safavid empires. Her research and teaching study questions surrounding the Sunni-Shiite conflict during the early modern period and how that conflict got entangled with political, religious, and fiscal issues of interconfessional and inter-imperial legitimacy. Her current book project is tentatively titled Sect and Sectarianism in the Early Modern Middle East, Ottoman Sunnism, Safavid Shiism, and the Qizilbash. It explores the Sunni-Shiite divergence, not merely as a religiously derived battle, but as one meticulously carried out in geopolitical and fiscal terms that form the basis of the sectarian conflict in the region. And I want to point out that she's also the winner of the 2017 Best Dissertation Award from the Ohio Academy of History. Our second workshop speaker is Dr. Michael Bechet, who received his PhD in 2020. He is Assistant Professor in the Departments of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies and of Jewish Studies at Pennsylvania State University. A scholar of the religions of late antiquity, Michael specializes in the history of early Christianity. His research centers on several interconnected topics: the development of authoritative traditions, their transmission and reception in diverse artifacts and across confessional boundaries, the significance of ritual and magic for the production of novel religious discourse, and the legacies of so-called heretical Christians within the beliefs and practices that emerge as orthodox. Michael explores these dynamics relative to the ritual traditions surrounding two figures, the Virgin Mary and King Solomon, two prominent characters whose authority span multiple religious communities and represent layers of cultural innovation and conflict. His current book project is tentatively titled The Virgin Mary and Ritual in Late Antique Egypt, Origins, Practice, and Legacy. It examines the significance of the Virgin Mary for ritual activities of Christians in Egypt from the early conceptual roots of Marian veneration in the 2nd century to its diffusion among the monks of Egypt in the 6th. The project challenges long-standing views that make the cult of Mary either a reflex of so-called pagan goddess worship or responds to controversies over the nature of Christ, Christological controversies. Above all, the heresy of so-called Docetism, that is, the belief that Jesus' humanity and or suffering were merely apparent and not real. Today, these two recent PhD history alumni who landed tenure-track jobs will lead a roundtable conversation on the successful navigation of the academic job market and the transition to a faculty member with practical survival skills and tips. The third distinguished panelist on our table is Dr. Maria Esther Hammock, Assistant Professor of African American History here at Ohio State, who will field questions during the Q&A parts of the program. So let me speak a little about how we're going to proceed. The panelists and I spoke about how to do this, and we agreed to make this more of an informal roundtable discussion. So feel free, please, to jump in and ask questions at any time. You'll see that there is a schedule of events, essentially 2 sessions of 50 minutes. The first is preparing for the job market, and then we'll have a break, and the second is surviving the job once you land one. And then we'll have a catered lunch delivered to the room. So without further ado, let's start with Professor Aisha Baltaji Ulu Brammer.
Hello everybody, it's very good to be here. It's very good to be back to where I spent 7 years of my life. It was, I think, the most challenging but also the most rewarding 7 years. I met my husband upstairs. I had my first child in the medical center here. I worked on and finished my dissertation here. And it was really a turning point in my life, especially as someone who came here from another country. So as Bert mentioned, we are going to have this more of an informal conversation. But the first thing that I would like to acknowledge is that I finished my PhD in 2016 and the job market was significantly better at that time, unfortunately, as opposed to now. They just released the data showing that around 70% of academic positions right now are adjuncts in American universities. That is, I think, the big elephant in the room that needs to be acknowledged, and that is an unfortunate situation. That was not the case, at least not similarly, when I was finishing my PhD, and my biggest concern was that, well, I was extremely happy with my department, my advisor, my second advisor, and my other professors, my cohort, but I had this fear that, well, I'm not at an Ivy League school. How am I going to compete with people who are doing their PhDs at Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Chicago? These are the schools that you will hear in my field. Of course, for other fields, it is other schools, but those are the fields. So that was my biggest concern. That was my biggest fear. I thought I had an immediate disadvantage, that these people, the search committees, wouldn't even actually look at my job material, application material, if they don't see Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and then what am I going to do if that is the case? Because I cannot change that. That is not something that I can improve. That is not something that I can lie about or I can maneuver around. But my experience, for the first time that I applied for jobs and the second time, my first job was at a public school at upstate New York. At Binghamton University, I was an assistant professor there for 2 years, and in my second year, I applied for the position at NYU. Both times, I actually pleasantly surprised that there is an increasing awareness for the value for public institutions and the quality of education that we get in public institutions, or how name actually doesn't just rule out everything that you want to see or you don't want to see. So that was assuring, and after being the faculty member at 2 places, I can tell you that I also saw that continuously people are not really stuck with the names. Maybe some people here and there, but in the greater scheme of events, when committees are looking at the application material, they really now more and more realize that there are hidden gems. There are actually original, strong applications. They may not have the fancy title coming from an Ivy League school, a prestigious school, but it is worth looking at everybody equally. So that is one thing. I wanted to start with that because, as I said, this was the biggest fear that I thought I was going to suffer from, and that did not turn out to be the case. And hopefully it will be the same for you and for your job applications. The second thing that I would like to mention is that if you are considering faculty positions, if this is your dream, if this is what you see yourself seeing, start thinking about that, not in your last year, but as early as possible in your PhD study, because there are actually multiple things that you have to start or you should start doing, and you shouldn't leave them to the last year of your PhD, the year that you're applying for programs or you're applying for positions. And there are a couple of things that I can mention what you should start looking or what you should start working on. And one of them, and that is a very cliche sounding word, is networking. And what I mean by that is that, of course, you have to network in however you define it. And even at a place like Ohio State, where you have an extremely strong department with like 40, 50, I don't even remember the number of the faculty members, what I realized in my job application adventures was that on the other side, as faculty now who are reading job application material from others, if in your application you can show that you actually ventured out, you actually communicated, contacted, engaged with other scholars, other cohorts through conferences, workshops, and there are of course other ways of doing that, but these are the major, more conventional ways of doing that. And if you actually can have a reference letter from a non-Ohio State professor in your field to support your application, that also makes a big difference. Because to me that shows that, of course, your advisor is going to talk very nicely about you, or your professors, because I assume you are all good performing students, but the non-Ohio State professor is going to say something else. Because you probably didn't take a class with this person, but you probably met this person at a workshop or at a talk, at a conference, at a panel, and that letter is going to confirm your ability to communicate, to have an intellectual interaction with someone outside of your department. I think in many cases the search committees look for that to see if you have been able to create that type of connections beyond, not only within your department, but also beyond your department. And it's always good to have different institutions listed in terms of where you are getting your support, right? Not just Ohio State, Ohio State, Ohio State, but if there's someone else that is going to make a difference, that is going to actually show that, yes, your success, how good you are, is confirmed by someone else, by another institutional affiliation. So I don't want to dominate I don't know if this is good enough just to start. We also have, Michael and I brought our cover letters for the first time we applied for jobs. So one last thing, I'm more than happy to share my cover letter, diversity statement, teaching portfolio statement, etc. that I used. I'm sure there will be an opportunity to share our contact information. Please feel free to reach out and ask me to share or ask me to read your material. I'm also more than happy to read your material and give the 2 cents that I have for that. Thank you.
We have the cover letters up there.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we can get to it if we want to at any point. But
and I'll also be happy to share
Yeah, please do.
my materials too. So for anyone.
well, I'll just start by first reiterating a few points that yes, the job market doesn't look great. I don't know that it ever looks great any particular year, but it's just the nature of the thing. So one thing to add to this is, expect, if you haven't been told already, and you probably already know, that this could be a multi-year process, right? That you might not get that first job immediately out. Maybe it's a fellowship or a postdoc, which frankly could be a better place to start than that tenure track job. When we get to talk a little bit how to succeed in your first few years, one thing I would say there is, if you are coming out of a postdoc or fellowship, that actually puts you in a really great position to succeed in that first tenure track job that you get. So anyway, just saying that. Real quickly, I want to say, I'm going to talk just briefly about my journey, because what I want to emphasize, and I'm sure you might have heard this already, is that everybody's journey on the job market is a little bit different. Everybody's experience is a little bit different, so it's wonderful that we can offer you our 2 cents, but this isn't the end of the conversation for you guys. Anyone you can ask, you get as many viewpoints as you can, get as much eyes as you can on your materials, and try to come up with what makes most sense for you in your particular situation, in your particular application and destination departments, and so on and so forth, because that's always going to be the case. People are going to differ on what they think. In my case, I graduated 2020, also spent 7 years here. Very fun, exciting, challenging time. I came almost straight out of undergraduate, did a post-bac, and then came into this. I was very nervous in the beginning because I didn't have a master's, so I thought this was going to hold me back. But everything turned out okay. I actually did not immediately go for an academic job. I ended up teaching high school for 2 years in San Francisco, and eventually got the job I did because people in my network informed me about it. I wasn't even looking, but said, hey, this looks like it's very suited to your background. Maybe you should consider it. And so I did, and it's the only one I applied for, and it just happened to work out. So it's one of these very lucky situations where things just worked out nicely. So that's kind of the background experience that I'm coming from. And by the way, if anyone is interested in what it's like to teach at a high school, I'm happy to talk about that too. You can take me aside or email me or whatever, and we can chat all day about it. Some of the things I want to underscore that Aisha already mentioned here, the value of a graduate education at a public institution. I mean, this can't be understated, right? And especially when it comes to your teaching experience, which is huge. I mean, as much as, you might hear people are going to prioritize research, and it's absolutely important. We can talk about some of the ways to spell out your research and make it clear to them that you have an agenda, multi-year agenda, multiple book projects, and these sorts of things. But one of the things that really separates candidates is your quality as a teacher. And part of the reason why, I mean, you kind of think about it from their perspective, after that initial job talk, occasionally in the hallways, people will ask you, what are you working on, and that sort of thing. But mostly, every department meeting is about filling classrooms, right? Filling seats, what kind of courses you're offering, how you're bringing new students in a major. Can they imagine you in the role of a teacher who's going to be able to attract more students to whatever field or discipline that you teach, right? I mean, this is really what's on everyone's mind and leaves the greatest impression. So don't want to underestimate the value of what you get at a public institution, which is more opportunity to teach courses, teach your own courses, hopefully a diverse range of courses, and all that shows relative to the other candidate who's had very little experience of this. And I say this as someone who served on 2 job committees last year hiring for teaching faculty, and there's just a complete difference between the ones who have all the academic chops and ones who clearly have not spent enough time in a classroom and don't know what it's like being around the average student, the typical college student, which is probably what you'll have in your cases. So wanted just to underscore that point. I have a whole list of things that I think went well and maybe some things that can be improved. I don't necessarily want to monopolize the time here, but I do want to maybe underscore one other thing you talked about here is networking. I'm going to add to this and say, in addition to networking, maybe outside your institution, is also learn to think outside your field, right? Because chances are, if you're going to end up in something like a history department, or even maybe a smaller department that's centered around your particular field, you're going to interact with people who do things that are different than you. And you're going to need to communicate your research to this widest possible audience, and also be able to offer the kind of courses that can appeal to a wide audience of students as well. But how do you do that? How do you get that ability to talk across disciplines? Well, it's engaging with them to some extent, right? So it is things like attending various workshops or talks in the departments, right? Networking at conferences, attending panels that maybe are adjacent to what you do, but not precisely what you do, right? These sorts of things. So you become a little bit more conversant and fluent in fields beyond your own. And it frankly helps your own research to realize the differences between what you do and what others do. So I just wanted to add that in terms of the networking. I think I'll also stop there. Again, I have a list of a couple of things that went well and didn't go so well and so on and so forth. But as we said, we really want this to be a conversation with you and make sure that we address whatever questions you may have. So
can I piggyback on something that Michael just mentioned? So of course, one of the things that we all had to, or public institutions, is teaching, right? Because your stipend is attached to you working as a TA or a grader or a research assistant, and you have to do that. And at the time, it really looked burdensome. Like you have to do your regular coursework, but on top of that, you have to do your assistantship. But there are, as you mentioned, advantages to that. And being able to talk about teaching at the level where you have 4 years, 3 years, 2 years experience at the graduate student, while you are still a graduate student, is a huge plus. But I would like to mention another advantage that actually comes with teaching. It made you actually able to talk about your research in a more relatable way. So that is something that I kept hearing at places that I applied, or the people that I talked to during the job application processes that I went. People who applied for these positions from places that they did not have to teach, that they did not actually have to interact with undergraduate students, they were really talking about their research in a way that it was just irrelevant to most of the the people in the room. So they weren't able to answer the question, so what? Even though I am an educated faculty member, I am an expert in the other topic, I am an early modern, let's say, Americanist, or I work on 20th century China, and you are here telling me that this topic in the 16th century Anatolia is important. Why would I actually care about this? So people who are coming from hardcore, as we call Ivy League or Ivy League plus places where they don't have to interact with undergraduate students on a day-to-day basis, they really isolate themselves in a way that their research is of course important, but it is not relatable. And then when you go to a job talk, when you talk about your research in a way that like this is important, everybody's topic is important, everybody is doing something original, especially if you get to that point, if you are considered for a position at a Skype, Zoom interview level or a campus visit level, it means your research is original, but they want to see something more than that. They want to see if you can make this relatable, if you can make this broad enough to actually make it interesting, right? I was told again and again that like the people you competed for these positions, they were the experts of this 20-year period, but when you asked what does this mean for the broader Middle East, for the broader global history, or for the broader understanding of religion or politics or state formation or whatever, they just froze, because they spent 7 years, 8 years, 9 years on talking about, thinking about, writing about on that 20 years, and they didn't have the opportunity to actually make it relevant, broader, and bring in other books and arguments for a world history class, for a Middle Eastern survey that they had to TA or they had to teach, or I actually taught and TA'd for an ancient history class here, because that semester that was the only option, and I am a early modern Middle Eastern persons, but I actually had to learn with the students. I mean, I don't remember much now, but at the time it made a whole difference in terms of like opening up new perspectives. So that is something that needs to be underscored, that teaching or having to teach is hard. I know how time consuming it is, but I think it is important to focus on the advantages, the positives that it brings with us.
And just to add just a little bit to it, and then I promise we'll let you guys ask questions, but you're right. I mean, and it bleeds into many other areas. I mean, you're definitely going to get a question about DEI, for example, or various acronyms to that sort, and this is one too where you can clearly see a difference between the way people communicate the significance of what they work on, if that's all they've ever done, versus having to have done that with some real experience in the classroom. The answers are just worlds different, right?
Yes.
And it comes out in the simplest way. I mean, someone will just ask you, what sort of textbook would you use for this course? That's a very popular question that you might get. And if you just start kind of rambling a bunch of textbooks that you haven't given it much thought, and you're like, okay, or if you pick something that's really inaccessible to students, but maybe is like a primer in your field.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, right? As opposed to the person who's given some thought to multiple textbooks that they've seen and what they consider the advantages or disadvantages, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's very obvious when someone has experience, the kind of assignments their grading policies. I mean, I'll give you a negative example.
The class management, it's a big thing, class management.
Yeah, I'll give you a negative example without naming the person, but, someone said, when it comes to deadlines, I sort of have no hard deadline policy, right? Until maybe everyone here who's taught, how crazy that is, right? Where it's like, you're going to wait till the end of the semester to get like 40 I mean, this person's clearly had no more than 5 students at any time, and that really was the case. I mean, had one semester of teaching, and they had 5 students in Egyptology, very dedicated people who wanted to learn hieroglyphs, like fantastic, but that's not the typical experience. So it's those kinds of things that show. Anyway, we can get off this, but.
So I think we can move to the presider of the Q&A. If we could pass the baton, which is by me, I mean the mic. Maria, if you could sort of talk about your experience, and then we can open it up to questions.
Thank you. No, I think I'm actually learning a lot, and I wish that I had consulted with you guys when I was on the job market. You guys have given very important, invaluable suggestions of how to be better marketable out there in this intense job market. But so I'm here. I'm teaching here. I started in August, and my first year, so I'm getting adjusted. But the job market was certainly intense. A lot of the feedback that you've heard from Aisha and Michael are on point. This is a multi-year, the market today can be a multi-year process for many of us. I was in the market not as long as some of my friends and colleagues, but I was in the market for 3 years. So be prepared for that. So that is invaluable advice. Networking is also something that I found very helpful because I had to access mentors and individuals to write letters of recommendation that were outside of my home institution, and that is what allowed me to, I did spend some time in a postdoc before getting this tenure track job, and it was certainly because of those networking experiences that I had early on during the PhD process. And so it was a bit discouraging, but I am very excited that you mentioned early on that the fears that you had, because I know that all of us have fears going into the job market or finishing up a PhD, and seldom do anyone addresses that those are valid fears, but you should not be discouraged. It is fears that we all have, and so don't let that discourage you, but be aware that those are fears that they're not just, you're not just experiencing them yourselves. Across the board, all graduate students across the board, and even in places like the Ivies, they are feeling the same way. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of things that I could say about my experience, but I think that this could very much flow organically, and I think that your questions will help that process go organically. So I will field some questions now, and if you raise your hand, I'll write your name down, or if there's a queue, which I'm assuming there will be a good queue that keeps us going. But when you do ask a question, say your name and your field. So do like a mini introduction, so that this is also for your practice. You will be practicing on who you are, and so that we can get that from you, and then you ask your question. And I think that would be a wonderful, model. So I'm opening it up for all of you. So who wants to go first and yield the first question or set of questions?
Hi, I'm Daniela Edmeyer. I'm in French colonial history. Thank you guys for those initial comments. That's it's really helpful. My question, I have a follow-up question on the question of networking in kind of developing, because I've been thinking about this as well, but I feel like there's for me at least, there's a certain disconnect of a lack of depth of true connection with the person you might be trying to network with. Maybe you're on a panel with them, maybe you do attend some kind of event with someone, and you think that there is something to pursue there as far as a professional network connection, but there's not really a lot of opportunities to continue following up with this person or continue engaging with them in a way to really foster a relationship where they would be a useful person to use as a reference. Do you have any kind of suggestions or feedback on how to really kind of strengthen that professional relationship with people that you are passing into conferences, these kinds of events, but don't necessarily attend the same institutions, so you're not seeing them on a regular basis?
So I can talk about couple ways of doing that, and of course, it is not like you want to network with this professor and he or she is going to be open to that idea. Sometimes there's just a big wall there and you have to acknowledge that and move on. One of the ways to do that is to see what workshops, panels, conferences are there, who is organizing them, if they are smaller in a way that are more welcoming to sit down and talk to people and make yourself heard and communicate and interact with others, or if these huge conventions that are taking place. So the first example example is usually where you build these relationships after spending 2 full days with, let's say, 15 people in one room. You really start to know each other. You really now remember who's who, where they are coming from. That may happen, that may not happen, but at least be on the lookout for these opportunities in your field. Regional conferences are actually great. Regional workshops are great for that purpose, that bring people together from different schools, from different institutions in a small, more manageable, more intimate context where you can sit down and talk about your research, also hear about others. The other example that I can give, and of course this also requires some institutional support, but I assume a department like Ohio State History will be open to at least entertaining this idea. Let's say there's this professor in your field, and you really would like to know this person, but you just don't know how to do that. Talk to your advisor, talk to your department, invite this person for a talk, and be the one organizing this, right? So every department has a budget to bring speakers. You can create a panel, or you can just have this one-off lecture. You can tie it to a theme that is going on in your department or not. But you really want to have this person come to your department and talk to you in a way that it's only you doing this. There are not like 10 other graduate students in your field getting together in a workshop environment. And that will create an opportunity for you to be known, also for you to ignite something there with this professor. And then this doesn't mean that that professor is going to be the amazing reference letter writer for you, but this is just one idea to think about, in addition to being in the lookout for regional conferences and workshops.
So I can speak to that because I'm the director of graduate studies about what the budget situation is. Every year, our fiscal director sends an email out to the faculty saying, if you wish to invite a speaker to campus or organize a workshop, please submit a budget. And this email goes out during the summer. And I actually received that, and I responded with this program. Not sure whether I'd get funding for it, but we did, because I made a case for it. And so the timing of all this is that you should talk to your advisor now in the spring semester. Tell your advisor or tell the professor that you work with here that you would like to have that person respond to this email positively and say you can work with the budget with your advisor. And because invitations need to come out like 6 months in advance or more for something like this. So we do have money in the department. The grad students probably don't know about it. I do know that the response has not been large for these requests, which is a little surprising, but faculty are busy, and but we do have money for that. And we also have money for you to go to conferences, which I've sent emails about, but we do have money for that.
So I want to, so that in terms of networking, so I totally agree with everything that's been said. So I have, this is working, right?
You and I are good.
Yeah. I mean, we could also share if you want. I don't want you to have to just pass it all day. I think when we think about networking and the results of it, be flexible, right? So the goal isn't just to get a reference, because frankly, that's probably one of the hardest things to do, is for somebody to interact with you long enough and can speak to various aspects of you as a scholar and everything else that would actually materialize into a very good reference letter. But possibly that could happen. But there are many other ways that networking will benefit you. So, Aisha mentioned, for example, finding those conference panels and such that you want to attend and then hopefully present on to get your work out there and make yourself known to a community of scholars that works on the things you work on. Hopefully that results in maybe being invited to give a talk at the next big conference or something like this. And an invited talk is more impressive than one that you submitted a paper for a conference, these sorts of things. I mean, you can say that you were invited to give these lectures, whatever. You will be considered perhaps to write book reviews. In my case, I've been sent several book reviews to write because, well, people remember I kind of work on this topic, and so here you go. And especially as an early career scholar, that's a thing that people count on you to do. which is great. It's a little line in your CV, it's a publication, but it also asserts your authority in that field that you're qualified to review this recently published book, right? So there's all kinds of ways that networking can actually help you. The name recognition of your advisors here already, I mean, that's networking, right? It makes a big difference if somebody picks up your application and knows, I know Bert Harrell or whoever it is. I mean, it's one of those things where we want to think it's all based on the merit, but it's not. I mean, it's also who you know. It really matters when you have like 200 different applications and something pops out about one. I mean, that's networking, right? So I want you to think sort of flexibly about the ways that networking actually will help you, including, in the future, you might apply for a grant, and the people overseeing that grant might be someone you've run into or at least attended one of your presentations, and you might be able to mention that. Or an editor of a particular journal is someone who presided over one of your presentations or talks or panels or something like that as well, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can use networking, quote unquote, to your advantage.
And I have one more piece of great advice. And I don't know if it's because I like talking or I like, approaching people and introducing myself. But one of the things that really worked for me to keep those network relationships in many words, I guess, alive or going, is I would send, individuals that I meet at conferences, emails, thank you for meeting, because sometimes I will just email them, said, hey, I know you'll be there. I'm very excited about the book that you just published. Do you have a few minutes to talk? And then I'll meet them at the conference and talk, and then every so often I will send them an email and say, hi, give them a brief update of where you are. So when I finished my Ph.D., I sent all of those individuals an update of, hey, I got a postdoc, I'm going here, just briefly. So you keep that going. And that works because you are remembered, and especially those individuals that you want to keep as letter writers, it's important you keep them in the loop of where you are. If you are in the job market or about to be in the job market, make sure you reach out to them and say, I'm about ready, I'm going to be on the market. And so just keep them updated so that when you do need that letter, you're not just out of the blue after 5 years say, can you write me a letter? So that way, you keep them updated of what you're doing. And that was very helpful for me, and I think it could be very helpful for all of you as well.
And the last thing I'm going to add to this, networking happens also with your peers. Right, so it's not just looking for that established scholar in your field and trying to get an in with them. If a group of your peers, if y'all can collaborate and say create a panel on some conference or something like this, I mean, that's wonderful, right? I mean, this is what all of us will be entrusted to do at some point anyway, right? So, it's not just a vertical relationship, but get to know other people, your peers, hang out with them, become friends, don't, whatever, but maintain some kind of contact relationship. In the future also, I mean, maybe this is a discussion for the surviving the job market sort of thing, but one thing one thing I found, right, is when you get that position, it can be a little bit isolating, like you're the one person doing the thing that you do, right? So that network of your peers becomes more important. You can do as little as form book clubs or reading groups, language reading groups, or there's an important text that was published in your field, and so you want somebody to talk to about it, right? That matters because eventually, and if not already, those people are also in departments where maybe there's funding, either as graduate students or thereafter, and they're thinking about who they might bring, to participate in the conference, which is really good for their resume, but also works in your favor too. It's like a win-win, right? So, horizontal networking as well, as much as vertical.
That is actually a great advice. And one quick thing to add to that, not only within your cohort, the people that you started together, but also people who are in your field but started their PhD 3 years, 4 years, 5 years before you did. I just have Yeet here. And I remember asking him the silliest questions because when I started, he was finishing his PhD here. And the advice that he gave saved my life. And that is also networking because these people are going to be done with their PhDs while you are still working on it, and they are going to be at positions, either academic or not. Now, to be honest, we have to be also open to idea of thinking about or working towards other types of alternative career paths, as they are called. But there is this type of like genealogical connection, right? The advisor and this advisor's students, or the fields and the students who finished their PhDs within that field.
Yeah.
For us, it was the Ottoman history here, and there was a good amount of people, a good amount of cohort within it, where I felt comfortable going and asking, what am I going to do? This is the problem that I don't know what to do about that. And it doesn't mean that everybody is going to be easily or equally approachable, but there's always great way of finding mentorship, not only with your advisor, but also in the group, in the graduate student body, that with students who have been there 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I encourage you to actually pursue that. Some departments do that more officially. They like buddy people, pair people up within their group or beyond their group, etc. But just don't sit with that and see what else there that you can actually create another, maybe just another type of mentorship relationship or connection with someone who was there 5 years ago, that you are doing the same thing that you are doing now.
All right. So who wants to go next? All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Emily Burdick. I'm in African history. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, because postdocs have been just sort of like mentioned in passing moments, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between postdoc applications and doing those at the same time as entering the job market, and how that process differs, or like what are the benefits versus where to allot your energy essentially when you're like on the market.
Maybe you should look at your letters then.
So I'll say maybe in terms of the biggest difference, probably a postdoc position does not include any teaching, right? So that will not be much of anything that you discuss. I mean, you could mention it as, you're an aspiring scholar and you hope to teach these sorts of courses and so forth, but ultimately you're not gaining the position to teach. You're there because you have a research agenda and you're going to produce a set amount of quality work during your postdoc, right? So the focus is research. That's the biggest difference. There's really not much of a place to talk about teaching. Also, postdocs typically are not expected to do service, but to indicate that you are interested in collaborating with people and promoting this and that initiative never hurts, because at the end of the day, you may be a postdoc somewhere where you are networking, right? And who knows, maybe someone there might like you enough to write a letter for you, or some collaboration results from it. And being a willing participant, and even trying to assist whatever department you're in, agenda, and doing this and that helps, right? But again, that might also be a difference where you're not necessarily expected to do any kind of service. So that's what I would say are the biggest ones. Yeah.
One other thing I may add is that usually you see that more with postdocs. There's a theme for that year's applications, and that is not necessarily how you will talk about your research for a job application, but you really need to make yourself a good alternate, a good candidate for this specific theme. So you may have to revise where you're talking about your research based on what the theme is for that specific postdoc, right? So, and that also goes with not only postdoc or tenure track positions, but the tenure track positions within themselves also differ significantly. If this is a teaching position or more heavily teaching position, if this is a R1, or if this is a liberal arts college where you are going to actually, they already tell you what you are going to be teaching, or this is a place where you will have the opportunity to create new classes, or this is a place where teaching is going to be on the second level, at least in the cover letter place. So then you will have to have almost like not 2-3 separate cover letters, but certain paragraphs that you will actually either drop or add based on what job you're applying. I remember the one that we are going to see here, it was University of Nevada with a good teaching load, and of course it is a place where you're also required to do research, but it was in Princeton. So what I did was that for research-heavy positions, I added a whole separate paragraph that was a continuation of where I talk about my research. And for places where teaching teaching was mentioned from the get-go, I had a separate paragraph that was just on an additional teaching. Courses that I can afford, the class management, the experience that I had, etc. So I actually rotated in between in terms of where I was sending my application. The majority of the cover letters stayed the same, but I just tweaked it around in terms of if this is a teaching heavy place or a research heavy place, what they want to know more about. And you have to, of course, guess after a certain point, but that is something that you will also have to do within the job market, the academic job market, but the postdoc, of course, you have to think about research more.
I'll say a couple more things about the postdoc or fellowship. So absolutely the case, right? So usually a postdoc has a particular theme, so you write it differently than you would your cover letter to present your research as fitting that theme, and you want to emphasize what exactly you will finish doing during the duration of the postdoc, right? Because that's what they want to know, that you're probably going to have to publish something and present some work at some point. But the other thing you can do with respect to the postdoc is, if possible, look up who's gotten that sort of postdoc before, if it falls under a particular theme, what kind of projects were supported, and so you can kind of understand, what they tend to look for, right? Because there's a difference between how these things are sometimes advertised, and within that, how particular committees, think and what they desire from an application. So some of that information you can glean just by looking at past postdoc recipients. And then the last thing I'm going to say, there's a world of difference between how these things look between American postdocs and fellowships and then the European system.
Yes.
And as far as the European system goes, it can, I applied unsuccessfully for one, so just let me say that, right? But there was quite a learning curve for me. So my advice would be, if that's one that you're interested in, see if you have anyone that you can contact to show you an example of what these things look like. They're typically very rigid and point scored, and you have to be within a particular percentile before they even consider you, and then funding runs out by a certain point, right? So it's a different system, and anyway, again, for me, it was quite a learning curve. So I would highly recommend, if you're thinking about any kind of European postdoc or fellowship, take a look at, see if someone is willing to share that with you, so you have an idea of what that looks like.
And that is an effective practice. Reach out to someone who either had the postdoc that you want before, or someone who has it now. They're going along, and more than likely they will respond and help you answer any of the questions that you have. So don't be afraid to reach out to postdocs, especially those postdocs that you want to get, or that you're would like to secure.
Yeah, they'll know things, right? Because they hear talk around, and they understand maybe the kind of candidate they're looking for, what you might be able to emphasize on your application. So that's really good advice. I did that.
Sometimes they can share their materials too.
I did that with a USC. Which again I didn't get, but anyway, I did that with a USC fellowship. But it was useful. It was useful to talk to that person and learn from them what went well.
Yeah. All right, I think we're going to be looking at, Daniela, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't want to, okay. So I know obviously the question I'm about to ask, the most obvious answer is like you can get these examples by attending job talks and kind of observing. But I was really intrigued when you guys were talking earlier about like this textbook question. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about either specific questions or areas of interviews from your own personal experience or from observing others that you think people struggle with, and like things that we can think about, like how to more effectively prepare for, when we get those job talk interview like invitations.
Yeah. Do you mind?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I can tell you some of the basic questions you're going to get, right? One is something like, describe your research, right? Describe yourself as a scholar, and the main thing to do, sort of as Aisha was saying here, is be able to communicate your work, first of all, to the widest possible audience. Talk about methodology, talk about the type of materials you work, not necessarily the specific things, but then, of course, you can go from the general to the specific, right? So often think about the work you do as a case study for something broader, right? Because most likely you're going to be speaking to people who are not so familiar. Now, granted, you could be in a department like mine that at least studies the ancient world, and so I don't have to tell them about the Hellenistic period or something like this. But I did at once interview for a job where I did say the Hellenistic period, and someone eventually asked me, what do you mean by that? And which was surprising me because I thought all historians know it, but I guess not. Or like, but that could happen, right? So, this again is where teaching experience comes in handy. You want to talk smart, and you are, of course, communicating to people who understand historical methodology, but they may not fully understand the nature of your specific field and the significance of what you do. So that's where you want to emphasize that. One tip I would give you here is learn who may be on the committee, and especially anyone who is any adjacent field, and learn what they do. People notice this, like whether you have a sense of what the faculty of that department do or not. And so, for example, we've interviewed people who clearly didn't know who they were talking to, and it's like, okay, I mean, it doesn't necessarily hurt, but it's far better if it sounds like you are ready to engage in conversation with these folks, especially if there's anyone in an adjacent field, because while you want to acknowledge what they do, you also want to be clear that what you do is different, not in any hostile way, right? Like, well, I think everything you do is wrong and I'm here to revise your work, but in a complementary sense, right? So there's that question you're going to get. You will definitely get a question about teaching. It'll probably be something like, you would be expected to teach XYZ bread and butter courses in your field. How do you approach teaching that course? And then, depending on the nature of the course, you'll probably get another specific question. In my case, since I teach religious topics, it's always, how do you teach, religion at a secular university, right? That's for me, every single thing, you're always going to get that question, and I ended up asking many people that same question when we were interviewing them as well, right? Whatever the question is in your field, that's maybe the sort of thing that you would find out by talking to more people who have some experience. And there is, prepare yourself for that sort of thing. Think about the way you approach the classroom, how you set up the course, right? So what's your plan for the course? What's your kind of general theme of the course? If you could boil it down to 3 takeaways, what are they? You can kind of think in those terms. Once more, you can kind of think about methodology and sort of the broader takeaways, almost the kind of things without repeating verbatim that you find on a syllabus. That's like, here are the goals of the class, right? But not exactly, right? But think in those terms. And they may ask you in that case what sort of textbooks you would use, and here again, you want, at least for those courses that you can anticipate being the bread and butter courses in your field, consider. You would know, right? You should know. Research those textbooks. See if there's substantive differences, why you would prefer one over another, and have an argument, right? And it's not that anyone's going to hold you to it. And in fact, probably if you get that job, everyone's willing to share their syllabi with you, and it's not like you have to create the course from scratch, right? But it helps to know that you've given this some thought. And let's see, the last thing I was going to say is, what was the last thing I was going to say about this? Oh, have an answer to a question that's something like, if you were to create courses, maybe an upper level course in your area or in your specialty, what would you create, right? And here again, you want to think about some of those broader themes where you can use the specific materials of your field as a case study, right? So, in my case, I said things like, like asceticism or hagiography, or, the orthodoxy and heresy, or gender in the ancient world, or ancient magic, those kinds of things. And especially if it has something like magic, right, with a sort of an attractive title to it, consider 2 or 3 options like that, right? But you want courses that treat assorted sources from your field under a broad theme that's suitably comparative, but not so comparative that it's no longer historical, right? That kind of thing, right? And then the last big question I think you can always expect is one on DEI. And here, you'll have to give it some thought and see what is authentic to you and your response, but I'm just going to give you a caution on a couple things. First, I've seen people react differently depending on how personal the response is versus how academic it is, right? So if you speak from kind of personal experience and background versus maybe relate it to your academic project and how it represents some kind of intervention in the space. With people on either side, some really prefer the academic response and think, well, that's great, that's what they're looking for. Others kind of, well, no, I love the fact that this person talked about their background, how they struggled through this and that, and it's created this passion. So I would say find a balance, right? If that's you, right? You don't necessarily have to fill it in or make things up, but that's what I would ask you to think about doing. And be mindful, not that you shouldn't talk about this, but everyone talks about representation in some form, right? So That's fine, right? But everyone hears that as a response. Someone's going to talk a little bit about representation. Someone's also going to talk a bit about how their discipline has racist roots or things like this. That's fine too. You can always talk about these things, but also consider some of the other ways that set you apart from candidates. Keeping in mind, one of the objectives here is they're trying to think about how you're going to attract students from diverse backgrounds and bring them into your classroom, right? So if you kind of think about that objective as well, you might be able to speak to different experiences, various initiatives or classroom policies or whatever it is that you do that has resulted in, more contact, more engagement with students, and then maybe even, more people interested in what you study. I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
I'm actually going to pick up from the last point, the DEI, and then go back to the teaching part of it. I'm very critical about the DEI policies in the United States, how it is done, but this is another topic for another discussion. But the one thing that I would like to bring is that when we are talking about diversity, it is not, and it shouldn't be only about ethnicity, race, and gender. It is also about the diversity in terms of different approaches, different methodologies, different sources, different viewpoints that you are bringing to the class, you are bringing to the discussion, and you are actually going to make your students conscious about or aware, familiar about that. Because when everybody, and especially now, the Supreme Court striking down the whole idea that you cannot consider race as a point for admissions for undergraduate, also has ripple effect for graduate admissions, and I think it's going to have a ripple effect for job applications where the lived experience is very important, and I think it should, if the place is asking for a diversity statement, just try to make sure you are not using tropes, because on the other side of the place, when you are reading, it is so easy to actually see who is just checking certain boxes, like did I mention this, did I mention that, and it is really obvious who actually says it because it's really a part of who they are, or they are saying it because they feel the pressure they have to mention these things, which is the part that I am the most critical, that actually this puts people in places where they talk about their lived experience in a way that is not natural, that is not organic. But how would you defeat that? How would you cope with that? Especially if you are not necessarily in one of these boxes. What are you going to do if you are a white male Christian background person? Don't feel you are automatically disadvantageous. There are ways, again, to talk about how you are going to make that environment, teaching environment, diverse, and how that can be done even as who you are and the background that you are coming from, and how that is going to make it actually important and relevant, because whatever perspective you have, not everybody is going to have that anyways, even if it is the most generic version of the applicant that you can imagine. Going back to the teaching. Sure.
Right here. I mean, you actually have a great advantage because you are at OSU. Always mention that you at OSU in teaching settings, which many people don't have anyway. You interacted with many people from many students from very diverse, I mean, literally very diverse backgrounds. That, I guess, that additional sentence.
Yes, exactly. When you just stuck with how diverse you are, then it really gets into cliche very quickly. But when you make the discussion broader in terms of how you create diversity in the environment that you are a part of, either as a faculty or a teacher or a colleague or a cohort member, then you actually start to see that, well, yes, this is what we want. We just don't want to check boxes in terms of if we have X amount of people for this box and that amount of people for that box, right? That is what I was trying to say. And Yeet actually made a great point in terms of being at a public institution, the diversity that you have here, particularly socioeconomic diversity, that is a gold mine to talk about and to bring to the fore in terms of how you are dealing with first-gen students and how you're incorporating them. Social capital is something that is really making a huge difference in terms of how you are talking about yourself, how you are talking about knowledge, and how you are producing knowledge, and what type of disadvantages it actually creates for people, right? In Ohio State, you have that. You have people coming from rural parts. This is a state institution, a landmark. You actually see people, they are not maybe checking boxes for certain types of diversity, but in terms of class, in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of being a first gen, being a military, being this and that, you really have that. You have something that not many people are going to have if your competition is those people coming from Ivies and Ivy pluses.
And I don't mean to interrupt, but yes, 100%, and especially the comment here, I mean, just want to underscore that. The fact that you can claim that you've led classrooms of students from such diverse backgrounds across all these various spectrums is enormous, right? That you can say that you've had students with, first generation students all the way to, whomever, and that you've taught courses typically for students who are taking it as a GE. I mean, that actually is a genuine advantage because we're also thinking about, diversity in terms of life paths and goals and objectives and so on and so forth. And so for you to speak a little bit about communicating the significance of what you do to that audience, right, and all their diverse goals and skills and whatever else, I think also contributes largely to diversity. Yeah.
And I think we're at time, but I would say to conclude this section, be genuine in your applications because nobody else can be yourself but you. So be genuine. Committees tend to like that. So.
Yeah, I'm looking at the time, and we're going to have a break now. This is a wonderful discussion. Let's get back at 10 after 11. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can start with the 11.
Sure.
Professor Aisha Baltaji Ulu-Bramer and Professor Michael Bechet, segueing from preparing for the job market to surviving the job once you land one. And I think we'll start with the segue about the job letter.
So one quick thing that I would like to start here is that if you are doing your PhD in a field where the names or the places or the concepts that you are talking are not going to be as legible or as easily understandable as if you are doing American history or European history, you really have to consider that and keep that in mind in your job letter, but also in your conversation when you are at a campus or when you are doing Zoom interview, right? So one of my major recommendations for that will be when you are in your cover letter, when you start talking about what your research is about, try to start in a general way without using any specific term, place people have a hard time to read, people have a hard time to pronounce. So don't make it hard from the get-go. Just try to ease people into what you are doing and start from something. Still, it is going to be about your research. It is going to be about the place that you are working on, the topic that you are working on. But it may just do it in a way that is easier for the non-expert audience to actually understand the first sentence that they are reading. So you can look at the first sentence that I put. So if you look at the very itty-bitty of my research, it is very time-specific, region-specific. There are a lot of names, a lot of places, a lot of locations that you are going to have a hard time to pronounce. You are going to have a hard time to actually conceptualize where this place is and where these people are coming from, etc. So I didn't want to really scare people. And I started with the broad intervention or the implication of what I am doing for the broader understanding of sectarianism in the early modern or the modern Middle Eastern context, because everybody, regardless of their field, regardless of what they are experts of, they have heard Sunni and Shia. And that is something that I wanted to open up when I was I'm going to talk about my research, right? That's why the very first sentence is about where I have done my research to show that I have done research in places that you can easily identify. Like, I'm not listing the archives that I've been to or the collections that I have done research, but places, two major places. I have done research in Turkey and in Iran. And in this research, based on this research that I have done in these two places, I look at this broad topic. What is that broad topic? Oops. Is the Sunni-Shia divergence, right? So I wanted to check out two main things that are at the core of my research. The first one is I look at the Sunni-Shia divergence in the 16th century between the Ottomans and the Iranians, right? And because when we think about them now, Ottomans are considered to be the guardians of Sunnism and Iran is considered to be the guardian of Shiism. And this actually started in the 16th century. So that is the first thing that I want, without going into details. First thing, my research is on Sunni-Shia Asia divergence in the early modern period. And the second intervention that I hope I am doing in my research is that I am not a religious scholar or scholar of religion. I am doing this from a perspective of political economy. I'm doing this from the perspective of looking at this development as a historical development, not as a religious development. And I wanted to mention this from the get-go because these are the two main things that I want to make sure that the reader, without going into the details, very itty-bitty details that they will get. And how I did it was that not merely as religiously derived, but as a meticulously carried out geopolitical battle between these two empires. So this is one thing, and you should keep that in mind when you are doing your Zoom interview, when you are doing campus visit as well, when in the Zoom interview they are going to ask you, give us an intellectual biography, tell us about your research. So find a way, and some people call this like the elevator pitch, right? So find a way that you start talking about it in a way that is broad enough, but still interesting enough that will capture the attention of the audience. And in your second, third, fourth sentence, you will slowly ease into the details that are going to make your case interesting, but also important. You are doing something that others have not done. So you also want that point to come across, right? But do that in a way, especially again, if you are in a field where the names are difficult to pronounce, places are difficult to contextualize. So I'm going to stop here. I don't want to dominate.
So very quickly, just going to jump, and 100% agree with you. In fact, I do the same thing. But I wanted to just quickly talk about some of the things that I think I did well, and then maybe one area that I would totally do differently. Well, not differently, but add to. Anyway, so similarly, right, this is my whole paragraph where I describe myself in the most general terms that I can think. But that still speaks to people who work in the ancient world and so on and so forth. Then I talk a little bit about my particular work, and then I finally get into the dissertation, right? That doesn't mean you have to write in 3 paragraphs, but the same kind of concept. The one thing I want to point out here, what I would probably have done differently is, moving on from the dissertation a little bit, I finally talk about my sort of research agenda, right? That one of them, of course, is going to be to write the book, which more or less derives from the dissertation, but very important, consider having a second book project in mind, right? Especially if you're applying to an R1 school or something like this. It's not that you have to commit to that project, but they want to know that you have a long sort of trajectory, that you're not thinking just about tenure and then you're going to relax, but you have multiple projects on your horizon. So if you can mention a second one, that's a good idea. But here's where I would have done something a little bit differently, and you can start doing this now. It's really good if you can mention that maybe you've already contacted editors or you've considered where you might publish your book, right? So which press and so forth. University presses are the gold standard. So aim high, search a few of them. In my case, Oxford University Press or University of California Press both have great series, and these are things that, thankfully, by the time I was doing the job talk, I mentioned, right? But I wish I could have put them in the application as well. It never hurts to start early if you've already finished your dissertation to write that book proposal, or at least take a look at what one looks like so that you can talk in terms of how a book proposal is written, right? Because that's, to an extent, that's how they're going to evaluate your readiness to actually transform the dissertation, which maybe by now you're going to refer to as a manuscript, to that book, right? So the more you show that you're prepared to do this, they're already thinking ahead. What does your second year review look like, right? And by that point, they have certain benchmarks. If you can demonstrate you are already prepared to meet those benchmarks already in your application, then you stand apart from other candidates, right? And mind you, you're applying from a certain position. Other people may be applying from that postdoc or fellowship or a different assistant professorship, and so they might already have that in theirs, and so you kind of want to speak on the same level. And then the last thing I'm going to point out, in the exact same way we're talking about sort of going from the general to the specific, you should do this also when it comes, for example, to teaching, right? So when it comes to teaching, I did list of the courses that I've taught. It was appropriate for this application because many of them are the sort of courses I might teach there. But I have a little paragraph about how I proceed from conceptual frameworks to the particular, right? Before I even say specifically, whatever else about teaching. Similar thing, what was mentioned back there about how, you kind of create an inclusive and accessible classroom and so forth. And then again, when it came to DEI, same thing. I sort of think about ways that I can speak generally about this, how it relates both to my background and maybe some of my research interests, but then I go specifically into something about, what I've done working with students and how my particular academic interests also dovetail with this DEI agenda. So kind of think about those three sections, but all having this kind of funnel approach to them, go from the general to specific. Okay, that's it. That's all I want to say about that.
Yeah. All right, so we can now move to surviving the job once you land one.
So do you want to start as we did the first session, where you each talk briefly and then we ask for it to flow organically with questions from the students?
Either way.
We got a question?
May I have a quick question before we blend? Because I still have some questions about
And your name?
accounting. My name is Marva Savaş. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the history department working on late Antiquity Byzantine history. And I target history, but also classics and hopefully medieval studies departments. So I was thinking maybe potentially publishing outside history, but more like in target department-related journals would be a good idea, or it's giving actually like more scattered, intellectually not consistent background.
So there are two things that I would like to mention here in terms of publication. When I was finishing my PhD, if you had an academic journal publication, that was considered out of norm. That was not accepted, but more and more people started to publish as they were still writing their PhD. Right now, it is actually way past beyond that. People are expected to publish academically during their PhDs, and that is hard, but I think it really prepares you in terms of intellectually, but also the conversations that you are going to have during the interviews, either on Zoom or on campus, because it is a whole different world when you get started into publishing and how it works and how it functions, the problems and the methods and what you need to do, what you shouldn't do, etc. But one other thing, so when I was doing my PhD, there was, and I think that online publication is still going on here, called Origins.
Yes.
I was approached by the editor of that online publication. And that was a time where the war in Syria was going on, and I'm working on Tunisia stuff. And then he asked me, would I actually consider writing something on the war in Syria and its relation to Tunisia conflict? And at the time, and I remember thinking that, like, is this gonna help me in my job applications? Because this is not peer review, this is not paper publication. But I did it, and that was the smartest decision that I've done, because that article that I published is still the most cited piece of work that I have done. Even though it came from a departmental online platform, it really struck a chord for a lot of people, and I'm still seeing it in a lot of academic publications. People are referring to that, and that really still come across like, oh, so I remember your work on the war in Syria. So consider that type of publication as a way not only to practice your writing and your skills, argumentative skills, in terms of how you're arguing your topic, how you are abiding by the word limits, right? That those are big things when you start getting into the world of publication. But it is really making you more versatile and bringing new talking points when you are interviewing. Since the ultimate goal is to get a job, to land a job, the more you actually have in your toolbox to talk, to bring, the better you are going to be, the more precious you are going to be for that the applicant pool, right? When you bring it up, like, I actually published in this online departmental journal, and gave me an idea. If the department that you're applying doesn't have anything like that, you can bring it up and say that, like, this actually made a huge difference in my life, and I am interested in launching a project like that for the history department that you are interviewing. But they are looking for new ideas, what you are actually offering to bring to the table, right? Not anything crazy. They don't want to hear something. They all know that it's undoable, it's impossible to do. But these ideas that you actually bring with you, carry with you from your previous life in the PhD, they are going to make you not just like a student, because they are interviewing you as a cohort, right? As a possible cohort, that they are going to make you look actually very serious in that position that you're applying for.
I would say at this stage, go ahead and publish where you think the piece fits best. Don't worry too much if I publish it here, will some department, misinterpret me as a scholar versus another. I mean, these sorts of situations are, in my opinion anyway, very difficult to try to game. I mean, the most important thing is you have that publication. And if you think from the perspective of, let's say you get that tenure track job, What you'll need to do is essentially by your 5th year, even though usually it's 6 years, but really it's your 5th year, you will assemble a portfolio. Your book will be the centerpiece of it, and then a number of publications, roughly at a pace of 1 a year, maybe more. It's about the same for you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. So think around like 5 articles, something like this. And depending on the school, some will not count previous publications towards that. So mine, for example, Penn State is an R1 school. They don't count anything I published previously, right? So from that perspective, really all they're looking for is that you have a number of publications alongside your book, that they are in leading journals. Now I say quote unquote because they don't always know what a leading journal is, and they have various methods of deciding if they might just simply ask you to name what are the leading journals, and your reviewers may not necessarily know either. But they typically rate peer-reviewed journal articles ahead of, say, something like in a conference proceeding. Not that conference proceedings can't be, perfectly wonderful work and even peer-reviewed, but again, in general, when people have eyes on your portfolio who maybe are not so familiar exactly with what you do, that's maybe how. But in general, I would say don't necessarily, other than trying to aim high, right, don't necessarily worry too much about, publish it where you think it's going to get published, right? And go ahead and send it out, even if you feel like it's not perfect. Because the review process can be really good feedback as well for you. And it's great experience. And on top of that, things can take a while before they're reviewed. And then let's say it's a revise and resubmit, then that adds more time. And then, by the time that gets in press and so, it can be a long time, and the clock is sort of ticking, and you want to know if this thing is going to be published, right? While you're applying, I think as Aisha said, nowadays it's good to at least have 1 article. You've heard it, it's true, publish or perish sort of thing. And frankly, I think it's true regardless of if you're heading towards more of a teaching job or a research job. Everyone wants to know that you're engaged in your field in some way or another. I was a finalist for a teaching position, but even though it wasn't a formal requirement, they really still wanted to make sure that you were going to publish the book while you were there. You get what I'm saying? So I have a friend who works at a Cal State, and if you know anything about the Cal States, they tend to, they tend to cater to a demographic that has been historically marginalized. Students who maybe come from certain backgrounds, low income, first generation, these sorts of things, and so he has to teach a lot of courses. But his department is the kind who really wants it to be, on par with any other history department. So everyone has the same tenure requirements that I do, and he teaches way more than I do, right? So you can never be sure, right? But it's one of those things where people want to see that you're an active scholar. So if you have something to publish in classics and medieval, late antiquity, whatever, go for it. Just submit it to where you think it has the highest chance of being published right now. That's my job. I don't know if you guys are.
One quick thing to add, and you guys may disagree with me on this.
No, that's fine.
But that was a piece of advice that I was given, and I give my graduate students, that during your PhD and also probably in the early years of your non-tenure years, do not publish book reviews, because they really don't bring anything other than a possible hostility. Because if you are writing a book review just to say something amazing, just all the book review is about how amazing this book is, then nobody is going to take it seriously, right? But if you are going to write a genuine book review that will talk about the goods and the bads of the book, why would you do that in a place where you are still trying to establish yourself and you are trying to pursue relationships? Nobody wants to hear the problems with their books. I wouldn't want to hear that. And yes, of course, we are all going to do that, but there are plenty tenured people to write nasty book reviews, and don't be one of them, because there's really no reward in that, considering the risks that you are taking with writing a book review. Instead of book reviews, as I said, publish on alternative platforms, blogs, even blogs that you are actually going to be on topics that are related to your research, that are going to be more beneficial for you than writing a book review in an academic journal.
I will offer a different perspective, let's put it that way.
That's why I knew that.
And it might all depend on what you feel is the personality of your field. I don't know, but you can write a book review where it's critical but not nasty, right? And so I certainly feel that pressure. Whenever I write a review, I praise, I mention all the things, but then, I write it where I'm focusing on specific methods or specific use of materials, and I raise questions, and I say, this particular argument hinges on how we assess this, right? So there are ways to do it where, you're thinking, you're allowing your reader to think critically without necessarily being nasty or, basically declaring that this book is garbage or something like that. So, and I think the payoff of it, right, is it is a publication, right? But it also, more than that, demonstrates to your audience who's not going to read these book reviews when they assess your application, that you're someone who's relied upon in this field as an authority to some degree, right? And I think that benefit, for me personally anyway, outweighs the potential danger you do by alienating what is, I don't know who. If someone has told you that this is a person to be afraid of, like they hate any word of negativity in their books, then okay, maybe say no to that one. But otherwise, I think it's a good chance.
How toxic your field is, right?
Yeah. And people know, and your advisors probably know. They could probably tell you if you're not sure. Hey, I've been asked to do this review. What do you think? Is it a good idea? In my case, I typically did ask, and everyone would say yeah, and sometimes encourage me. It's like, hey, this book's coming out. You should see if you can review it. And I think it's been useful. And so anyway, maybe just a different perspective.
Of course.
Go ahead. A follow-up question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Zari Mahmoudi. I'm a Ph.D. candidate from NISA department, near Eastern and South Asian languages and cultures. So I wanted to ask, what is the case of an applicant if you are reviewing that, okay, he or she has teaching experience, but only one tiny publication, or maybe not even one, but is it the weight of the having publication is too much in being a good candidate for the tenure track job, or is it the teaching experience is more important, or how does it weigh when they're assessing the applicant?
I think it's about where you're applying, where the job is located. If this is a liberal arts college where the teaching is their main focus, and even in the ad it says that the person is the ideal candidate will teach this and this and that before talking about ideal candidate will do research this and this and that, right? So they are going to look at your teaching portfolio, what you can teach, what you have taught so far, and how you can contribute to this department's teaching mission. Right? But if you're applying to an R1, or even you're applying to a place, even though they are not R1, they still want to have a robust research agenda, then they are going to look at, yes, it's great. We want also, even if you have a job at Harvard, you are still going to teach. Teaching is inevitable. You are going to teach no matter what, but what is going to change, how much emphasis they are going to put on your teaching. Yeah. Your teaching rather than what you are doing for your research, right? So it is just the percentage in your application. But if you're applying for an institution that is that puts more emphasis on research, because as I said, either they are R1 or they want to pretend to be like an R1, then teaching is going to be important, but it is not going to be as important. That is hard but true. Try to publish something in your PhD, and that is going to make yourself actually an a candidate that is also going to teach you things that you cannot learn otherwise, because as I said, it is a whole new world once you get into that. And the other situation is the applicant pool. If everybody in that shortlist has at least one publication, the only way for you to compete with those people is to have a publication. That is also sad but true, right? So you don't want to make yourself disadvantageous from the get-go. Your research, maybe it's more original, maybe the topic and the methodologies and the sources are more demanding, but they wanna, at the end, they are gonna compare apples and apples. They are gonna see who actually published what and where. And the where question, you are absolutely right. Do not just past and present shouldn't be your first place that, oh, I want to have one article and it's going to be from this place. Amazing if you're that one graduate student who actually did that. That is unbelievable. That is so good. But you don't have to be that person who publishes it past and present during their PhDs. Publish in your area studies journal, right? Publish in whatever journals that are there. do not aim the highest as your first place to publish. Maybe you will do that in your job, right? So, but publication is sad but true. It's important.
And I would just answer more or less the same way, but I'd summarize it this way. It's, you will always need to think about research and teaching no matter the job. The emphasis is just a bit different. And one of the reasons why I earlier talked about the significance of teaching is because I just look at it as a place where you can separate yourself as a candidate. And if you are applying to an R1 school, everyone wants to talk about your research. And the more you can demonstrate, as I was just saying, that you are prepared to undertake, a multi-year project and then further projects beyond that. You've earned grants and fellowships or whatever and awards in support of what you've done. You have an idea of what it's like to contact editors. All these things are ways to still distinguish yourself as a researcher, even beyond publications. However, right, when they attend that teaching demonstration, it's going to leave such an impression on them. What you're like as a scholar in terms of how you communicate your ideas to others, and then what you're like as a teacher in the classroom and how you may be able to attract a cohort of students around what you do. It's always going to be important. So I would say do both. It's just the emphasis changes depending on what the job is, and apply for the specific job. Make sure it warrants repeating because you'd be surprised how many people don't do this, but read the job application carefully, right? They sometimes ask for specific things, which means you might want to include a paragraph on it or whatever in that initial application. But I say this because surprisingly, not everyone does this, right? You want to make sure you have a generic application perhaps, but then you tailor it, you tweak it a bit to fit each job. And maybe here we can kind of transition a little bit to surviving the job market, right? So, right, one of the things that you will find in that job is you of course will teach, and it'll probably be more than what you're teaching now, assuming you're teaching one course a semester, right? Has anyone here taught ever more than one? Okay, one. Yeah, more than one in a semester. Have you done that? Did you do that? Okay. So
We don't make TAs do that.
I did it. I did it multiple times.
We did.
But I liked it, but it was fun. It was no problem. But so first of all, you will have to be teaching probably a minimum of 2 courses, depending on where you land. So in R1 university, right? Do you teach 2? Yeah. And then if it's say a small liberal arts college or more of a teaching sort of situation, 3, maybe up to 4, something like that, right? So you will be teaching unless you've got the postdoc or the fellowship. And then on top of that, you want to maintain an active research agenda. And this is where I think submitting that first article, if you've never done that yet, is really helpful because it'll at least give you the experience of the process and give you a real sense of the timeline. And ideally what you'll want to do is devise a schedule for yourself where you have different projects in different stages, right? And it'll be too slow for you to kind of just work on one, submit it, wait to see, maybe it comes back yes or no, keep workshopping that until you get it. Oh, finally it's published, move on to the next one. Years will be going by and you've only got the one. So you have to figure out what is a good pace for you to try to have multiple projects in different steps. One thing that I would say has really helped me structure my time is doing conference stuff. So when people invite me or say, hey, would you be interested in doing this? I typically say yes, right? Because that helps me have deadlines and then generate new ideas, and I at least got the draft of a new thing, and then I can start to figure out how to fit in my schedule. When am I going to revise that? When is it going to be ready to submit? And because you never know. I mean, it could yes, could be no, and then that 5th year is kind of what's that looming deadline, and you want hopefully to have a minimum of 4, but hopefully something more like 5 or 6 or whatever of these in addition to that book. So yeah, kind of be prepared to balance both of these at the same time.
Wonderful. And as we move to the next section, I do want to leave you guys with one thing, back to the fear aspect, because as grad students, we have a lot of fears and a lot of insecurities, and we don't feel certain about producing. This job market does have emphasized, the job market you're going to face will want you to have some publications. So my takeaway for you is, do not be afraid to submit to leading journals. They will give you feedback. Even if it's a rejection, you will learn from those rejections and make that a much stronger article that you can resubmit to another leading journal. So don't be afraid to submit to leading journals. I think a lot of us, a lot of my friends were very afraid back then, but now it's like, we wish we had, because even if you are rejected, you get wonderful feedback. So
Everyone gets rejected.
rejection's part of our PhD adventures, I guess. So the next, our next section is how to survive once you get that job. And so I'm not sure how do you guys want to do it. Do you want to do it as we did the first section, or do you want to just field questions from the students?
Sure, if there are questions.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Julian Marbury. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Classics, interested in ancient religions. I actually had a question, about sort of adjusting, especially moving maybe with like family or like a partner. So, I even experienced this going into like graduate school, but my partner is a high school teacher, and that can be really difficult, like moving from state to state. So I was just wondering if, in your experience, like how much support your university or your college, wherever you've gotten a job, how much they give you in like relocating or even helping like your partner or your family like establishing themselves in the area, because that's like a really stressful thing in my mind.
Sure. May I?
Sure.
So before the job at Penn State, I was also a high school teacher in San Francisco, and then my wife, she's a nurse. Fortunately, she's a nurse, right? She can find work anywhere, but for substantially different pay. California pays enormously. State College, Pennsylvania, not so much. So there are a number of things that you can actually negotiate when you get that initial offer. One of the things you don't really need to negotiate all that much, at least for me, was moving cost, right? And this actually, the reason I'm talking about negotiations is because I have a point to make about this later. But so, at least in my experience, there was help moving us, and the department climate is one where everyone is really collegial and friendly, so helped us get settled, but this wasn't any kind of, institutional support as far as, no one is paying for our rent or helping us find a place or that kind of thing, but there were just really friendly people there. Also, the job is such that I can, for a nominal fee, get my wife insurance, so we have spousal insurance and these kinds of things, right? And those are the kind of things I think you'll just have to weigh your options if it makes more sense that he, through his job, has benefits that are perfectly good and work within your situation as opposed to, but there is typically this kind of thing. It just depends. But on a more personal level, it was an adjustment. And last time I dedicated years of my life to scholarship. I was basically living the bachelor life, right? 7 years here. I was dating her at a distance. We were engaged, but we didn't live together. It's a totally different thing, right? So yes, both of you adjusted this life simultaneously, which means there's more to negotiate and understand in terms of your schedules and how that plays out. If you haven't had to do that already, that's just going to be a new experience. For me, my whole first year was more of an adjustment than I expected it to be. Right, I keep telling people this feels like grad school 2.0, right, where in a way you're kind of doing the same stuff, but more, right? More teaching now, more research, and you're on your own in a sense that it's your responsibility, and no one is devising any kind of program of study or whatever for you. But there is a ton of support still, right? Assuming you landed in a department that's collegial and friendly, keeping in mind they want you to succeed. They don't want you to fail out after 5 or 6 years, you don't get tenure, then they have to justify with the dean gaining the monies to hire a new person in your area. Nobody wants a failed search, and nobody wants the person that they hire to fail in their position, right? So there is actually support. I was surprised to find that there's a lot more, workshop for, tenure line faculty, even for associate professors who participate, writing groups and all kinds of things, grant writing workshops and whole departments dedicated to helping you do these things. So you're not on your own. And that too, if you take advantage of these things, will help. The reason I brought up negotiating, I know it's something when you're a graduate student, you're like, just give me any job, who cares? Like, why would I dare negotiate? But it's your one time where you get to do this, right? It's not like traditional jobs. Okay, let's call it, where it's just kind of an annual thing, or maybe you have other jobs that are available and you can, leverage one against the other. I mean, basically you have this one and you don't see a significant salary increase until your promotion, and it's pretty standard. It's usually 10%. Yours too? No, I don't know what NYU does, but anyway. But it's, something around then. So it's worthwhile to think about what is important for you, right? And if you're in a situation where you have a spouse and they earn a certain amount and whatever, it's okay to bring that into the conversation as well. If you're planning maybe to have kids in the future, or if you want to own a home and so on and so forth, it's okay also to talk about some of these things. You don't want to be silly and just ask, for the sky without any justification, but you should feel encouraged, and they do expect some amount of negotiation for you to maybe ask more here or there, whatever. And I would also suggest prioritize what's really important for you, right? So if you want a couple thousand more in your research budget, but you could go without it, what you really want is an increase in your salary, ask for the salary thing. Maybe don't even think about the research budget unless they say no to the first, because then it's like, okay, well, you've asked for two things, we gave you one of them, and sorry, we couldn't do anything about this. You know what I mean? So I would highly recommend whatever is truly important to you. If you could not imagine taking this job if the salary doesn't go up a significant amount by whatever margin, or your research account just for the kind of work that you do and how much travel you anticipate, and maybe you need a research assistant and someone to hire to do the index of your book and all these things, you're just like, this is not enough, then fine, prioritize that and say, and justify it, right? But your situation, your moving situation, once you're offered, not before, but once you're offered, it's okay to talk about some of these things with them. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, yes, those are wonderful points. One thing that I may add, so if you have the dual body problem, that your spouse then you really are going to find you in a pickle. But there are ways to work around it or to make your case stronger. But in your case, as far as I understood, your spouse or your partner is not an academic, but someone who also needs a job. What I would recommend is to approach the university and to get their guidance and leadership, because all these places, especially if they are in college town, they are the biggest employer in that place. They all have career centers, they all have HR. So, and if you are going to move into a place where you are not from, you are not really familiar, then make sure that your case is heard, that you need guidance, you need help to not only situate yourself, but also situate your spouse, your partner, as early as possible, as successfully as possible. And all these universities have opportunities, sources, resources that they should at least tell you about, like, there's this center, there's this, and then you will pursue that. The negotiation part, you are absolutely right. And we all, of course, especially for our first jobs, we come from that place of insecurity that we always feel like, oh, I am so grateful. Do you want to give me $10,000 less? Like, why would you actually? Because we are all dying for jobs, right? But it is, as you said, it is the place to negotiate, and do not hesitate. What is the most important thing to you? For me, it was spousal hire, because my husband also was working. He was not an academic, but he was an university administrator. So I really needed to push for his hire before asking for more money for myself or my research. Now, when I think about it, I wish I actually asked everything that is all there. The worst case scenario, they will have said no to some of them, but I really felt like I have to prioritize. If I'm asking for a spousal hire, I cannot also ask increase my salary, right? But that was the most important thing for us, so I pushed for that. One thing, if your spouse, your partner is included in your negotiation somehow, in some shape or form, make sure it is written down what the university is going to do for you. They are going to promise you things. Oh yeah, we have this great center, don't worry, we are going to help your spouse to find a job. We have these opportunities, and we have these centers. Whatever they are telling you that they are going to do, that they are promising to do, make sure it is written in your contract that, so if and when they don't do that, you will say, this is a part of my contract that you are not fulfilling, this is your responsibility. You told me that you are going to find this or provide my spouse with that, you were going to do this and that. you need to do this. If it is on the speaking level, I actually got burned by this because the dean that I was negotiating was so welcoming and so nice, and between the time I negotiated and the time I started, the dean left. So the new dean had no idea who I was, had no idea what we talked about, had no idea how we negotiated and talked about my spouse's position, etc. And I felt so bad, like, why didn't I actually ask this to be written down? I was under the assumption, look how nice the dean is and how she's sending me all these places and putting me in contact with those people. When the dean is gone, it's gone. You really want it to be written, everything written.
And just to add a small thing to this, so typically the case, I don't know if it's ever different, but when you're offered, you technically have 30 days, right? Now, don't sit on, sometimes
So
not.
I didn't have 30
You didn't have 30
days.
days?
No.
What did you have?
give you?
A few weeks.
I had 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks.
Two weeks.
Not the full 4.
Okay,
I had 2 weeks.
whatever the time frame is, right? Maybe it's 2 weeks.
I had 2 weeks.
30 days, maybe, oh, who knows, or somewhere in between. The point is this, as long as you're engaged, right? I mean, you don't just disappear for, like 13 days, and then the last one you say, well, I'm still considering. I mean, that's not showing good faith, right? But as long as you're engaged and maybe you're, discussing various things that you might need and going back and forth and modifying the letter, getting things in writing, whatever it is, feel entitled to that time. I mean, it's okay, right? Granted, don't be so silly that you are just so difficult and you're not participating in this conversation. Do it all in good faith, but you're allowed to take this time, right? They cannot rescind that offer, whatever the time is, just because you've asked for something or just because you're waiting to hear from somebody else or something like this. Just keep the lines of communication open, and that's fine. And you just have to live with those consequences, but it's not your fault, right?
I do have something to offer in terms of, wonderful advice, but in terms of postdocs, if you are applying for postdocs before you get a postdoc before you get that tenure track, I didn't know that you could also negotiate for moving expenses, especially because the transition from being a grad student to being a postdoc or to being a tenure track is, vast. Like, there's a vast gap there, and you're poor here, and how can you afford to move when you graduate, that job stops, right? So you don't get another paycheck. And so I didn't know that you can negotiate for moving expenses with postdocs, but you can. So never be afraid to ask for moving expenses or any type of assistance offered from postdocs. I learned later, once I had signed the contract for my postdoc in Philadelphia, that I needed money to move. I was just so excited that I got that postdoc. I accepted like that day that I was on the phone. And then fast forward that, in May, by the time I had defended and my last paycheck came, and I was like, oh, how am I going to move? I can't put everything on my credit cards. So I reached out to the director of the postdoc and I said, I know I already signed, I know I probably cannot negotiate, but I need money to move. Is there anything? And he found me money to move. So don't ever be afraid to ask for something that you need that's going to take you to that place. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I would say this for those postdocs and fellowships, that includes what you think you're going to need for conference travel and research and those types of things as well. Doesn't hurt to ask, because in theory, that's what you're just spending your postdoc doing, is researching and getting your research out there and all these things. So you should not have to do that on your dime, right? It's just too much.
Yeah.
So I actually have 2 questions, but they're like intertwined, so I'm going to go ask both of them. So the first one might seem really basic, but I'm here to learn from you. So my question is that what are the sources you actually use when you want to look up for jobs? What are job options? What are the tenure track jobs right now in my area, for example? And the second one is that how much LinkedIn actually help you in finding a job and be open to job and job market, those stickers that they put on the profile pictures and all of those. This is my 2 main questions.
Sorry, the second one, what is it? LinkedIn. Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
you said you're in NESA, right? So for me, we are in same field. It was HNET, and I think that is also the same for different fields in history. HNET. So every job posted in the history, but sometimes you may miss area studies. So you are going to also look at like Middle Eastern Studies Association has its own website where they advertise jobs when they are posted. Also through Grapevine. Also there are websites, Wiki. There's something. What was it called?
Academics Job Wiki.
Wiki Academics Job. Yes, higher ed, and then those places. The Wiki one, that was the weirdest one. You not only see the jobs that are posted, but you also follow what position is where, because people post, I got a job interview, they asked me for more material, so you can actually follow where the position is, because sometimes you're going to apply and then 2 months are going to pass and then you have no idea what's going on, and then that website is a source of anxiety but also source of information where you see how things are. Should you still see this as an open window, or did they actually move on?
But one point.
Wiki plus Grad Cafe.
Yes, but of course, don't take everything.
I was going to say one word of caution here,
Yes.
right? If they're still accepting applications, don't trust any comment that says, "Oh,
I got
whatever,
that.
I got it, whatever."
Yes, yes.
There are, with a source that wide, there are some
and
toxic
everybody
people.
can go, and it is anonymous, right?
Who are
Everybody
trying to gain
can
an
go
advantage and keep you from applying.
put whatever they want to put. You can say that I got the job. Who is going to actually check it? You can say that. And why would you do that? If you have mental issues, you would. But considering there are people with mental issues, but it is. Yes.
But
yes.
I think so. In general, right? Talk to people in your field, and you'll find a list of sites that are typical, and usually they're associated with the larger conferences that you attend. So in my case, the SBL publishes all the different jobs, and SBL AAR, so publish all the jobs, not only.
Biblical literature.
So sorry.
Academy of Religion.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry.
They have a publication called Openings.
Yeah. So it's not only in biblical studies or early Christianity, but it's like all religion, that you can imagine. What's the classical association called again? I always forget this one. I haven't checked it in a while. SES, that's right. It's Society of Classical Studies. That's
Society
right.
of Classical Studies also has a job newsletter, at least it used to, with the APA.
Bizana, the Byzantine Studies one, also does it. Of course, HNET has, if it's history anyway, has all of these. Maybe there are also very field-specific places. Like in my case, it was the Coptic Congress has a website that occasionally posts job openings and things as well. Anyway, the takeaway is, you're going to find out in your field where these jobs are posted, usually associated with some large association or conference. But then, yes, there's the other ones like HNET and Wiki.
And through the grapevine, it's very hard to think that there will be a job in your field and you are not going to hear about that. Especially in a market where jobs are unfortunately not, like, we are not talking about 50 different positions. If there are only 5, 6, 7, you are going to hear about them and through your friends and colleagues. And
so along those lines, I wanted to say, right, so we're talking a lot about how to get to that tenure track job, but again, this could be a multi-year process, and the postdoc or fellowship out of graduate school can frankly be many times better in some occasions, because that's dedicated time where you get to work on your research profile, you get to take the book as far as you can, and so on and so forth, and really prepares you to have a great application for that next job, right? But it's also the case often that some of these postdocs or maybe visiting professorships and so forth are there because they're still waiting for approval from the dean to actually create something like a tenure track position. And so you often hear about these positions created, and then they ended up hiring the person who they know because they're a postdoc or visiting professor or whatever. Now, you can't count on it. I mean, who knows, right? But at the very least, this is also networking. I mean, you spend some time in that department, they get to know you, you've made a great impression, and maybe years down, 2 or 3 later, they actually want to hire someone in that field, and your name will come to mind if you're still applying by that point, right? So yeah, not to devaluate the postdoc or fellowship. I mean, in many cases, honestly, I think they can be a better place to start than just immediately into the tenure track job.
And I can talk a little bit about the postdocs I spent. I did a multi-year postdoc coming from an institution where I did not get to teach at all, that was very helpful because the postdoc did come with teaching responsibilities. And so that was my first introduction to teaching my own classes. And that, so also don't be afraid to apply to multi-year postdocs. At the end of those, you're better prepared for the market because you've taught your own classes and you've developed your manuscript further than just being the dissertation. It's now a manuscript, so that could also be something that you may be facing as well.
Yeah. For the LinkedIn, if this is a conventional academic position, I don't think LinkedIn is going to do anything for you. But if you're applying for alternative paths, if you're applying, considering different jobs at newspapers, journals, archives, museums, and think tanks, and TV channels, things like that, then I think it is a good idea to have an active LinkedIn page where people look at your profile. But if your goal is to get an academic position at the university, I have been applying but also reviewing applications. Nobody actually thinks about checking their LinkedIn page.
I mean, it doesn't hurt to understand social media if you don't, right? Because, one of the things you'll be required to do in addition to teaching and research is, of course, service, right? And sometimes service comes in the form of something like handling the social media accounts of your department or whatever, right? Or you're just, the person who's capable of offering that, and everybody else in the department who's never touched social media is like, oh, well, that's wonderful. This is our tech person. They can add all these things. So, I mean, the point being, yes, I don't think anyone looks at LinkedIn, but you don't necessarily want to present yourself as like the fuddy-duddy who's like the Luddite afraid of technology. It's like, it's okay. We have a Twitter, what is it called now? X. We have an X page, we have Instagram, we have Facebook, we have all those things for our department.
But also make sure that you have those professional profiles, especially if they're public, that they are, when you're on the market, that they are, I don't want to say decent, but that they are like professional. Because when I was on the market, my first and second years, I don't think OSU did this, but the people that were, that I got interviews with, some of those people in those committees started following me on Twitter. So I don't think OSU did, but so be aware that people will be looking for you. It would be beneficial as well if you have a website, develop a website where you present yourself so that you can include it also or at some point in your CV, so that they can see something that you created that's catered for the market, to give them another idea of who you are and the work that you're doing, because you don't want them to just find you on Twitter if you're not prepared. So a lot of my friends actually put Twitter on private during the job market. I did not. I mean, I used to love Twitter back then more than now. But I did notice that committee members would follow me, and that was a little unnerving. But be prepared because they might. So
I know people who actually put away their wedding rings for interviews. That is the insecurity that I was talking about. When you think the jobs are so scarce, and then you don't want to. If they see that I'm married, they are going to think that I'm also going to ask my spousal hire. So they cannot, of course, openly ask you. There is a big no if they ask if you are married, if you have kids, if you are planning to have kids, if you are planning to get married, if you have a fiance, if you have in a serious relationship. These are questions that they are not supposed to ask, and if they do, that's a big red flag. But people are worried in terms of who they are and what they are bringing to the table, and many of us have families by the time we finish. I had a kid when I finished my PhD, and that was a big concern.
I think we have another question.
No, I was just going to add on the topic of Twitter. I interviewed with the search committee, and not only did they go to my Twitter, they asked me questions about it during the interview.
Really?
Why I had the username I did, what I was doing with it, if it kind of had an academic function. So,
and the way that you are doing that actually is a great way of using social media platform to showcase your not only what field you are in, but your expertise. I mean, we are in the same field. That's why I know Chris and his Twitter. That is not necessarily how I use it. I'm the bidder person on Twitter. But Chris actually is sharing documents, and he is interpreting these very interesting documents from the archives and saying, well, look at this document and what it is saying, and then making it relatable and interesting for the audience. So you want that in your faculty cohort, right? Someone actually who is not only afraid of social media, but is using it in a way that is going to make the information interesting and relatable to broader audiences. So I applaud you for that.
Maybe if we still have time, can we return to like teaching portfolio? Because I'm very, very new. I have questions. I try not to be totally absorbed and get lost by the first time doing the teaching, because it takes time and we all know it is. But like, should we go for kind of building a portfolio, like more classes? Should we go for like really getting advanced in one class that we give, or should we like seeking, I don't know if it's the etiquette to seek some other institution when you're already a PhD candidate, not on the market, to maybe like in summer teaching, or is it like even efficient for us to do like time-wise? What do you think about that?
So, do you mind if I?
Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, prioritize finishing your dissertation, number one. Because, you know, it'll make worlds of difference when people are looking at your application, that dissertation is done or not. So just keep that in mind. That said,
You'll get asked that question.
Yeah.
How far are you along with that finishing in the job interviews?
Yeah. So, you know, but that said, if you think that you can also potentially teach in another department or something like that, someone's asked you to do it and it fits in your schedule and so on and so forth, maybe check with your advisor, make sure it's a good idea. Sure, I did that actually. I taught a course here at the same time I was teaching one at Otterbein. And it just so happened when everybody transitioned online, so it was hell. but for half the semester it was going really well, right? At other points, I was TAing for one class, and then maybe a TA dropped out of another class, so they asked, you know, would I mind? And I said, sure. And the specific reason why I did that was to gain a little more teaching experience in not only my core classes, which you at least want to have those, if whatever that might be for you. But I think as someone, Aisha, maybe you were saying earlier, it's also helpful sometimes to teach a little bit out of your area. It shows your flexibility as a teacher. So I taught, you know, the ones really outside my area were big history, but maybe I guess that's all encompassing, and then world history 1500 to the present. And I'm a pre-hot modern historian, so but it's helpful, right? It really rounds your thinking around these topics and allows you to communicate more broadly. So different job applications will actually ask for a teaching portfolio, which will typically consist of some kind of statement on teaching, where you spell out your teaching philosophy, and then maybe all the syllabi of courses that you've taught, and then your student evaluations as well. Though it sounds like increasingly people don't care as much about the student evaluations, but anyway, you'll probably have to put them in there. And it's okay for you, you know, in your teaching portfolio to say, highlight a comment that you think is really great about or maybe even ask one of your letter writers if they don't mind, you know, could you speak to this aspect of my teaching that you may have observed or whatever. By the way, if your advisor has never observed you teaching, you know, ask them to observe you teaching so they can mention that in their letters. So that's a typical portfolio. Now, not necessarily every place will ask to see it. They might only want the teaching statement, or they might only want just the syllabi for courses, or even just one syllabus for the course that you are going to be asked to teach, something like that. But yeah, the more you can demonstrate you have experience to do precisely the job you're going to do, obviously the better, right?
We're at time, but close.
Can I just add something quick? And we can, if you want us, we can eat and talk.
I was going to say the lunch is ready.
Yes.
Please. Yeah, you can go ahead and have lunch and continue the conversation.
Yeah. So one quick thing about teaching is that if I'm reading applications, in terms of, there are of course multiple ways of talking about your teaching, but one candidate says that they have taught 5 different courses, every semester something different, and the other one tells me that they have taught this course and they actually learn from how it went, and then they improve the class in this way by changing things, revising things, adding that, dropping that. To me, that is, even though it is the same class being taught twice, 3 times, to me that is more of a positive way of seeing that you are doing what you're supposed to do, and you're learning from your own mistakes, or you're learning from your experiences, and you are open to revising, changing things. So especially since you are teaching here, when you are still doing your PhD, do not feel pressure to teach something different every single time. To me, if you, in your portfolio for during your PhD, if you have 2 classes that you can talk in an authoritative way that I've taught these classes, or I've TA'd for these classes, these are the books that I've used, this is what worked, this is what it didn't work, this is how I revised it, this is what I learned from that, this is the questions that came up that made it interesting, this is how my research informed my teaching. Very specifically, this is what the the job committee, the search committee is looking, not the number of classes or the big diversity, big range of classes that you can teach.
And if I'm just one last thing to add to this, because that's a survival strategy when you get that job. Go ahead and teach those. I mean, if you're required to teach a couple courses and you end up teaching them again the very next semester, wonderful. Less prep for you, right? That's how you go from spending less time on your teaching to being able to work more on your research. And think about yourself as developing in different stages, right? I mean, when you're tenure line, you may not be the best teacher you're ever going to be. And sometimes, you know, the amount that you can give to your students is, maybe you want to be that person who has infinite amount of time to spend on them and answer emails and host multiple review sessions and office hours things, but maybe not yet, right? Because you also, your priority first and foremost is the book and your publications and things, right? So whatever you can do to cut down on that time, and especially teaching the same course over and over, wonderful, right? You may want to think about creating one course, over the course of all that, but
if you can teach the same class, teach the same class.
It's totally okay to be consistent.
And I think we're at time for lunch. I would leave you with one thing. Start developing your teaching philosophy and writing it down. It will become invaluable as you go into the market. Some schools will ask you for it, but it's good to know, where your practice lies. And so go have lunch and we can continue the conversation as we are eating. So.
Yeah, and please join me in thanking our speakers.